Welcome to This Week on History Chat. Our speakers are Steve Bull and Sam Gillis-Hogan. Their topic is Finding Faeries.
So just to kind of introduce ourselves, my name is Steve. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Bristol, and I study fairies predominantly in Romance literature, so the kind of dominant form of secular literature for about 500 years or so, from the 12th century through to about the 17th. So it's quite a wide period of time.
My name is Sam. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Exeter, and I study the history of magic, and my dissertation is on the surviving late medieval and early modern manuscripts containing rituals intended to summon fairy spirits, most of which are written between the 15th and 17th centuries.
Nice. Well, as we were chatting, we thought the best way to start this podcast would be, because we both study quite a weird subject, we thought a really good way to start this would be to both talk about the strangest anecdote or source that we'd come across in our research so far. So I wanted to start with a story. I'm going to talk about a French fableau called Le Chevalet qui fit le Comparle. The version I've got is Anglo-Norman, and it was kind of written around about the first half of the 14th century, but it does exist in a couple of older sources as well, in Old French, dating back a little earlier. And essentially, this story is the story of the knight who could talk to vaginas. And it's kind of meant to be a bit of a joke, a mocking story. Fableaux generally are quite bawdy, rude stories, and it sort of mocks the conventions of heroic quest narratives, you know, the knight going off on this noble quest to save the princess kind of story. And it starts off with this knight and his squire coming across these three maidens bathing in a pond or in a stream. And the squire, who's quite clever and cunning, he's far more clever than the knight is. He steals their clothes and takes them and hides them away. And these three maidens say to the knight, "Oh, you know, we're fairies. We'll grant you 3 wishes if you give us back our clothes." So they do. And the 3 wishes he gets are, the first one is that he will be welcomed into any home or castle that he goes to, which is kind of a romance convention anyway, this idea that you're supposed to treat guests hospitably and show them great attention. And the second is that any lady he asks will sleep with him. And then the third wish, the weirdest, the strangest wish of all, is this: any time he wants to, he can speak to any vagina or asshole that he chooses. Yeah. And so they go on, the 3 wishes are granted, and the knight and the squire head off on this adventure. And they come across a holy man coming down the road on his horse, and the squire kind of says, nudges the knight, and it's like, remember your power, try and, see if we can get some information here. And so the knight asks the horse's vagina where the 2 are off to, and the horse replies that the holy man is off to see his mistress. So the holy man's very embarrassed by this and gives them some money not to say anything. And the knight and the squire are very happy, and they head on their way, having thoroughly duped the holy man. And they come to this castle, and of course they're welcomed very graciously, which was the knight's first wish. And they come into the castle, and they're feasted and dined, and they have a good time there. And that evening, the knight asks one of the maidens there to sleep with him, and she agrees, and she comes back to the bedroom with him. But he hasn't got the squire with him anymore, and so he acts a bit foolishly, and he asks the maiden's vagina, "Is she a virgin?" And the vagina replies, "No." And the maiden's so embarrassed that she runs out of the room and goes and speaks to the lady of the castle. And so the next morning, the lady kind of calls the knight in and says, "Is this true? Do you really have this power?" And the knight says, "Yes, and I can prove it." And the lady says, "Okay, give me a second. And then you have to prove it in front of the entire court that you can do this and speak to me." But she goes away and she stuffs cotton up her vagina. And then comes back, and the knight tries to speak to her vagina, but he can't because it's full of cotton. And he's just about to be thrown out of the castle, and everything is about to go horribly wrong, when his squire calls out to him, "Remember that you can also speak to assholes."
My word.
Yeah, and so the knight then does. The knight then speaks to her ass, and the asshole says, "Yeah, the reason you can't speak to the vagina is it's full of cotton." And that's the end of the story.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
What a wild tale. And when was that written?
So as I was saying, the one I've got is the Anglo-Norman version. It's recorded in a manuscript from the early 14th century. But I think the fact it survives in about 6 other Old French versions. So I imagine it's probably a bit older than that. I couldn't find any dates for the Old French, but I'm guessing maybe 12th century perhaps.
Fascinating. Well, to sort of go off in a slightly different direction, one of the oddest summoning spells that I've seen is one that departs from traditional summoning spells. Most rituals to summon spirits originate in the medieval period as demon summoning spells, and you can see the general form of those reproduced in many rituals to summon fairies. But there's one that shows a lot of folk culture converging with that learned tradition. There's one in a manuscript from the Folger Shakespeare Library, which is manuscript VB26. And it contains a ritual in which you have to produce an ointment using various ingredients. These recipes for ointments to see spirits are quite varied. Some of them are quite gross, some of them are quite benign. But with this one, you apply the ointment to your eyes once you've made it, and then you go off and can now see spirits which are generally invisible to most people. And it says that there will be people who are immensely beautiful and handsome and wearing brightly colored clothes, and when you find one that you want, you can go up to it, and if you follow the ritual instructions, you can bind it to yourself essentially as a familiar spirit. And this takes a lot of tropes from traditional fairy lore, from the idea of these ointments to see fairies, to certain characteristics of their physicality, but it's interesting how elements of the ritual magic are interwoven with the folk tradition at the same time. It's perhaps not as lewd as your story was, and yet some are. There are several rituals to summon fairy spirits that, at least on the surface, appear to be intended to summon a fairy so that the magician can sleep with her, which is bizarre, because to sleep with a spirit, generally speaking, traditionally it was a demon, is something you would never want to do. You never want to step outside of your protective circle when in the presence of a spirit. If you did so, the idea was you would then be at its mercy. You would be outside of your protection. So the idea that you summon up a spirit, even though it's a fairy spirit, the idea that you would then exit your circle, presumably to sleep with it, is absolutely antithetical to anything that would have been done previously.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. That's because that kind of brings us quite nicely onto what we were going to chat about next. Is this idea of we both study fairies, we both have this similar interest, but we're both coming at it from very different perspectives, aren't we? You know, you from conjuring, me from literary sources. And in terms of, you know, are there similarities between what we're seeing and the way fairies are represented in these two different cultural niches, I guess?
Right.
And this idea of fairies as quite beautiful creatures that you'd want to sleep with is something that does seem to be a thing that's consistent across both our research topics, right?
Yes, our source traditions.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, certainly for me as well, you know, some of the things that kind of characterize fairies is this idea that they are quite ambiguous creatures, right? You know, you said that you wouldn't want to sleep with spirits because they might be demons or something. This idea of where fairies fit, ontologically speaking, like where do they fit in the natural order? Are they demons? Sometimes there are some accounts where they're like, are they demons or are they angels? Are they a kind of third category that sits somewhere else in this?
Right. I know that with the summoning spells, that anxiety is hard-baked into the rituals themselves. The people who are summoning them did not seem to have a very clear idea as to their nature. They were simply interested in what they were believed to be able to offer. But you can see this anxiety with frequent prohibitions at the end of the rituals that will say things like, once you've summoned the being, do not ask its kindred or its nature or where it comes from, or whether it be a human or spirit, lest it will take offense and leave, which once again is bizarre. In ritual magic, the spirit is bound to listen to the magician until the magician has dismissed it. But here we get this idea of this almost an arbitrary prohibition that the magician cannot break, or else it breaks the magic, which is, once again, it does not come out of this demon summoning tradition.
And this sense that there's always conditions that come with meeting with fairies, right? It's never, there's always something that the human has to do in that interaction, some rule that they have to abide by.
Right.
And you get that all the time in romance as well, this idea that a knight will stumble into a forest and come across a beautiful fairy, and quite often there will be a kind of contract of love between them. So a good example is the Marie de France's Lanval, which was written in the 12th century. The story of the knight who goes out into the woods and meets with this beautiful fairy maiden there, who's kind of richly adorned in all these fine clothes and in this kind of magnificent tent that's described as being like made of the richest fabrics that you've ever seen. And she said she loves Lanval, and she wants to marry him, or she wants to be with him. But the one condition is that he can never tell anyone about her. He can never let anyone know that she exists. And so he goes back to the court, King Arthur's court, where he's come from. And immediately Guinevere chats him up and says, "Hey, Lanval, you're looking pretty hot right now, can I?" and tries to get in on the action. And Lanval says, "No, I can't, I have to abstain," and trying to honor his wish. But then she kind of calls him out on it and says, I can't remember which version it is, there's multiple versions of the Lanval, but in one of them, her reason for calling him out is she says that he loves the company of young men more than he loves women. And he then retorts, "Actually, I have a very beautiful lady, and she's more beautiful than and her ugliest maid is more beautiful than you are." And at which point Guinevere's not happy. But that breaks his pact. And so he's taken to trial. And they say basically the only way you can redeem yourself is if your lady turns up and proves that she is more beautiful than Guinevere. But of course he's broken his promise now, so she won't come to him. Eventually she does. She comes and kind of saves the day and takes him away with her to fairyland. But there's this implication that, he's supposed to have honoured this one promise to her, and he breaks it almost as soon as he gets back to the court.
It's interesting. There's one element of that story that really echoes the summoning spells, and it was the prohibition that he never tell anyone about her. I can think of one manuscript that, well, really it's just a couple sheets of vellum with several spells on it, but it states that once you've bound the fairy spirit to you, she'll answer all these questions and do all these wondrous things for you, but you can never tell anyone that she is the one who effected those marvels. So you can see that echo there as well. It's interesting also how in the romance that you just outlined, his masculinity was questioned through the aspersion that he was gay, which of course in a medieval context would be quite a hit to one's masculine identity. But there's been some interesting work done about how ritual magic in general is sort of the action, it acts out a form of masculinity. Many spells to summon some spells to summon demons are intended to inflame the lusts, for you to get the demon to inflame the lusts of the woman that you're interested in so that she'll sleep with you, or even to spirit her away. It's even more explicit in these fairy summoning spells where the male magician is trying to summon a female spirit to sleep with her. And then there are other fairy summoning spells where you summon 3 female spirits. It's highly implied that they're fairies, and sometimes they're explicitly referred to as fairies. But you have to sort of set out a table for them, and then they'll come and entice you with their beauty and with food, but you can't accept any of their offers. To spurn the advances of the first 2, and then the third, which is the most beautiful of them all, will give you a ring of invisibility. and then you can sleep with her. So it's interesting how even in a spell where part of it necessitates that you reject immediate gratification, sexuality, the promise of the most beautiful at the end, finally fulfilling that masculine sort of identity is still there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, for most people today, the image of the fairy is more associated with the kind of like very diminutive, Tinkerbell-like character.
Right.
And it's interesting how much, particularly in the Middle Ages and then moving into the early modern period, how much fairies are quite often associated with this search for masculine identity.
Right.
And certainly in romance, that's a theme that comes up again and again, as it is associated with the male hero going off on a quest to prove himself. It's usually a kind of coming-of-age story or coming into inheritance of some kind that the hero is ultimately questing for. And it usually leads to marriage and the inheritance of lands or wealth or something like that. But it is very much this male identity quest, essentially, and quite often the fairy, who is generally female. There are some examples of male fairies. So the Green Knight in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one example, although there are plenty of scholars who would argue with me about the Green Knight being a fairy explicitly. But generally speaking, there is that kind of male identity quest.
Right. With the fairies sort of within my sphere, obviously the spells where you are summoning up the fairy, they tend to be female, and I will say that overall they are often female, but they are also by no means always female beings. There are multiple spells to summon up the fairy king, generally referred to as Oberion or Oberon. It's where Shakespeare got the name, and and I imagine that the text that I'm dealing with originally got the name from earlier medieval romances as well. But that's explicitly a male. Generally, he is instructed to appear in the shape of a 3-year-old boy, which presumably is because if you're summoning up a spirit, you don't want it to be able to entice you, and you don't want it to be able to frighten you, which is once again why those female fairy summoning spells, where they are supposed to be enticing, are so strange to the general summoning tradition. There's also a couple of spells to summon Tobias, which, at least in one, is referred to as King of the Pygmies. Pygmy sometimes being a word used as an equivalent for fairies, which is interesting because while fairies are sometimes depicted as being the size of a child, generally speaking, they are characterized as being the size of a human, at least in my material.
Yeah, and certainly Oberon, I think the first example I know of him appearing is the French romance Juan of Bordeaux.
Right.
And in that he's described as dwarf height, essentially. And I think that kind of may derive from the kind of Scandinavian, elves in Scandinavian folklore who are quite diminutive.
That is fascinating, but does not actually surprise me in a way, because oftentimes spells to summon fairies are to learn physic or medicine, and spells to banish fairies, or well, really to exorcise fairies from a person, are to remove illness from them. In fact, one common spell is to summon the 7 fairy sisters, but there is also a ritual to exorcise the 7 fairy sisters from a person as though they are fever and madness. But if you trace those 7 sisters to older manuscripts, they stop being referred to as 7 fairy sisters and start being referred to as 7 sister fevers, but by almost the same names. I think that what's going on is that there's this idea of these elf or dwarf entities, which in the Anglo-Saxon period were essentially synonymous with fever and madness, or spirits thereof. And there's this idea that, there are 7 sister fevers that are obviously named, so they're personified in some ways. Those must be fairies. So I think that, at least in my period, ideas of fairies were in part shaped by this earlier Anglo-Saxon idea of dwarves and elves.
Yeah. I think that kind of really highlights one of the other problems that I definitely have, and I'm sure you have as well, which is just trying to define fairies and there's so many different names and forms that they appear in, and as well, like throughout the Middle Ages, for example, people are so reluctant to name them. Kind of going back to what we were saying earlier, this idea of there being a fear in actually naming them or confirming their existence to an extent. There's this sense that actually going through sources and being able to determine what is a fairy and what isn't is this kind of endlessly challenging and occasionally traumatizing part of my research, at least.
I often feel like I'm pulling out my own hair with this exact issue. And part of it is that, especially early on, a lot of the summoning spells are written in Latin, and there is no Latin word for fairy. There are 1,000,001 cognates that seem to refer to fairy-like beings, but when I'm looking at a text that's referring to a spell to summon a sylph, or one to summon the Queen of the Pygmies, or one to summon Oberon, the spirit, if it's never explicitly referred to as a fairy, who am I to say that it is a fairy? What if the person writing it was just seeing it as a spirit, or what have you? Now, there are some sort of elements that can help. For instance, one such spell that refers to Oberon purely as a spirit is bound directly next to a spell to summon several fairies, and following a ritual to summon Tobias, which of course is another name that seems to circulate with connection to fairies. So you can sort of paint these constellations and contextualize and say, okay, well, this is the fairy summoning section of this manuscript that this is being lumped in with. Or there are other rituals that literally use pygmy, elf, fairy interchangeably. And so those sort of help show that, okay, well, in this period, these were considered to be interchangeable terms. There's one manuscript that very frequently refers to fairies as spirits of the air, which is quite interesting, really, because spirits of the air sort of harkens back to Greco-Roman idea of the daemones, the spirits of the air. And in the 16th century, Reverend Robert Kirk, in The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, suggests that maybe these fairies that the common people talk about are actually the daemones in the ancient tradition. So there are all kinds of different perspectives and ideas, even at the time. And as some of my manuscripts clearly show by saying, don't ask them what they are, even the people at the time did not have a clear idea about their nature. So yeah, it can be very difficult, particularly because the line not only between fairy and demon and fairy and angel are quite blurred, but there's also a significant blurring of the line between fairies and the dead.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly the same for me in terms of, just trying to ascertain what is a fairy and what isn't. And you end up kind of having to read between the lines on a lot of occasions, and you do. I mean, actually, a really good example is one of the texts I've already referred to, Marie de France's Lay of Lanval, where she doesn't explicitly state that it's a fairy that Lanval meets. But you kind of infer that from some of the signs, some of the tropes that are being used by her as a writer to suggest that Lanval is entering this slightly otherworldly space. So the fact that he leaves the established society of the court and moves away into an isolated wilderness, so that there's reference to a stream and a forest, which are both often associated with encounters with fairies. I mean, we saw that as well in the Fableau I said at the start, this idea that the knight comes across the three fairies bathing in a stream. So this idea that there's this kind of connection to natural spaces, like forests, water, caves, places like that are quite often where you find fairies. And then also these ideas of kind of like great beauty. They're usually the most beautiful person you've ever seen, and they're usually kind of wearing clothes fit for an emperor or something like that, just really splendid clothing. Or like there's another romance called Sir Orfeo, where Orfeo enters into the fairy realm and sees this castle that shines like crystal, and this kind of massively splendid building. But then also little things like, so in Marie's text, she talks about how where Lanval approaches the place where he meets the fairy, his horse starts trembling uncontrollably. This idea that even the horse senses something weird is going on. And you kind of just infer from these things, even if it's not explicitly stated to be a fairy, there are certain themes that carry on throughout a very large chunk of this period. So from the 12th century all the way through to Shakespeare in the late 16th, for example, in Midsummer Night's Dream, where you've got the same themes of these four lovers going from the court out into the forest. And there they meet the strange fairy characters who, well, they don't meet them, but they're lulled into this dream state, and all the kind of antics of who's falling in love with who derive from this encounter with the fairies, with Oberon and Puck, in a much the similar way.
You mentioned the Ballad of Sir Orfeo, and that's actually one of the ballads that I've had to look at to try to make sense of what I'm dealing with. Particularly, what I found fascinating about it is how it is so much a retelling of the Orpheus myth, but it puts the fairy king in the position of Pluto, which has all of these connections with both the dead and gold, in the Office of Spirits, which is a text that lists a bunch of different spirits and their properties and what they can do, so the potential magician knows which one to summon up. It lists Oberon, saying that he can bring vast amounts of wealth. Some rituals that say that he can bring wealth out of the depths of the sea and the depths of the earth. Likewise, one ritual is to exorcise the seven fairy sisters, but not from a person, but from a plot of earth where there is presumably treasure. The idea being that these fairies will protect their treasure beneath the earth. Likewise, other ones are to summon a fairy to lead you to buried treasure. The sort of idea of this chthonic world below the earth, where there is great riches but sort of shadows, so to speak, is definitely there. It's interesting that oftentimes the epithet used for Oberon in the summoning spells is the superlative of the Latin word fulgens, which means to glitter or glimmer. I think that perhaps that's coming from this idea that he's arrayed in gold and riches.
Which is quite a nice connection to kind of ideas, say, the underworld and Hades, and this potential classical influence on how we perceive fairies, and this idea of Hades being the place where you go when you die, but it's also the place where all the beautiful minerals and gold and diamonds and jewels all come from, and this idea that it is also a kind of splendid and beautiful realm at the same time. Right. This weird juxtaposition that you have with fairies, that they're somewhere between beauty and death, and like the kind of the sublime and the grotesque. And again, Sir Orfeo kind of a great case in point for that, because after he's seen the glittering castle standing there shining in the sun, he goes into the courtyard and he's greeted by this courtyard of nearly dead, disfigured bodies, all these people who the fairy king has taken from the mortal world seconds before they died. And they're all deaths that could be described as kind of, premature and unexpected, or, before their time deaths. So people that have been nearly burnt to death, or women that have died in childbirth, or people with their head nearly cut off or drowned. And all these people are kind of just drifting in this courtyard, kind of like a more gruesome version of the stone statues in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Oh. when they go into the Queen's courtyard and all the figures are there frozen in stone. Right,
that's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, just this very kind of grotesque scene after seeing this amazingly beautiful castle.
Right. I think that you've hit on something that is very resonant with my work, which is that juxtaposition between the grotesque and the beautiful. As I mentioned, a lot of rituals are worded with almost legalistic precision to sort of try to cut off all the loopholes so the spirit can't misinterpret you. And one of the things that they do is they direct the spirit, in this case the fairies, what shape that they should appear in, which does indicate that they were conceived of as not having a set form, that they could at least take on different appearances, and the fact that they're so careful, especially in the ones where you end up sleeping with it, they're so careful to specify that it has to appear in a beautiful shape. And while that really does seem to characterize sort of the feminine sexuality of fairies, I think it's also important to note that it's a bit of a trope in which trial records that women were accused of having slept with the devil as part of the pact to become a witch. What's interesting is that sometimes the women say, like in the case of Bessie Dunlop, when she was accused of trafficking with demons to heal people, she said that she'd never trafficked with a demon. She learned how to heal from her fairy. Now, she was burnt at the stake in the end, but that's because the clerics did not believe, the inquisitors did not believe in fairies. They believed that there were only demons that were preying on vernacular folk beliefs to trick people, and they were pretending to be fairies. But what's interesting is that in some of them, women claim to have slept with their male fairy familiars as part of constructing that pact. And to be frank, I would argue that in the cases I've seen in the ritual magic tradition, I don't think that the rituals are intended to summon a fairy to sleep with her. They look very much to me as though that sex act is part of the ritual to bind the fairy to the magician in an ongoing familiar spirit relationship, almost in an echo or an inversion of the consummation of a marriage. I'm giving away my dissertation now.
Yeah, so I guess one of the other things I really wanted to kind of chat to you about is what differences we see between the medieval period and the early modern period, and to what extent the perception of fairies changes over that time. Because that's something that's quite central to my research, at least. But I wonder if you see much difference in your own.
Well, in my sources, fairies seem to be relatively stable from this very sort of medieval tradition, this idea of them being more often than not the size of a person, the least the size of a child, and having this sense of wonder and danger at once. That seems to be quite stable. I'm not seeing a lot of variety. How about yours? How do things change?
I think I'd agree that in sense of popular tradition, in terms of folklore and superstition and rural tradition, there does seem to be a continuation. The problem with the medieval period is that there's so few sources to refer to, because no one writes about what the common people believe, for example. There aren't those accounts, whether they're kind of uncomfortable about writing about fairy belief or whether it's just not important enough for it to appear. You don't really get anything, you get a few accounts in the 12th, 13th century, people like William of Newburgh, Walter Map, Gervase of Tilbury, who are kind of commenting, taking stories that they've heard from people and retelling them. So stories about William of Newburgh gives this account of a man who was riding home from a friend's one night a little bit drunk and sees this door in a hill and goes into the door, and there's a fairy feast happening inside, and the fairies offer him a goblet to drink from, but he knows that he shouldn't eat or drink anything that's been given to him in fairyland, so he throws the contents on the floor and runs out of the hall still holding the cup and kind of rides off back to his own village. There are very few occasions where you get these accounts, and Newburgh seems to think that this is believable. He kind of justifies it by saying, this happened, I know the hill is near where I grew up, so that makes it true. And he also suggests that the cup then went on to be a royal heirloom. It was given to the king at the time, which is Henry II. And it then becomes a royal heirloom that's passed down through the generations. So there is very slim evidence of that. But you kind of, in terms of literature, the Middle Ages is very much centered around this idea of fairies as a mirror image to the aristocracy, as this thing that knights go out and find, and they look and act like a noble would, like a refined aristocrat is meant to act, showing greeting people and welcoming them into their homes, feeding them, dining them, and then kind of showing them courtesy and all the things you'd expect of a chivalrous or noble person. In the early modern period, that changes slightly, and you start to get this influx of folklore culture into mainstream popular culture. So with the emergence of the early modern stage, for example, you suddenly get this influx of fairies appearing on the stage, but they're far more centered around folkloric traditions. So Puck in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream is generally considered to be this folkloric character, Robin Goodfellow, who's this kind of hobgoblin domestic kind of fairy who's supposed to kind of help out. You leave things out for him and he does chores for you. But if you're bad, if you're a bad maid, for example, you might get pinched, or bad things might happen. You might, mess up the house or something. And so that begins to feature in things like Shakespeare's work. You also have the kind of the fairies of the Merry Wives of Windsor, who are fake fairies. The people of Windsor in costume, but again they've got this idea of like pinching someone because they've been bad. Is this kind of folkloric trope that begins to appear at this time a little bit more.
Interesting. Well, your comments actually did make me realize there is quite a difference. Even though the fairies people tended to summon do seem to be much more that aristocratic, beautiful, wondrous variety, the very fact that so many of these spells were written in the 16th and 17th century shows that there was such a rise in interest in this subject that all of a sudden people are starting to try to summon them. So in the sense of interest in fairies, I think that the very fact that so many of them are from this period shows that there's a rise in interest among the people writing the spell books as well.
Yeah, certainly amongst the people, kind of the writers who are talking about this, there's this sudden interest in recording it, it seems. You get writers like Reginald Scott talking about fairy belief and how it was something that was practiced in years past but doesn't seem to be much of an issue now. Or even James VI, when he was King of Scotland, wrote this demonology about witchcraft and demons, and kind of condemned any fairy belief as associated with demons. And so even the future King of England was writing about this subject. Then there's I think the one I love most is during the late 16th, early 17th century, you get these pamphlets being circulated about court cases where people have been tricked into believing in the Fairy Queen by con artists, by cozeners who come along and say, if you give me some of your money, I'll set up a meeting with the Fairy Queen, and then she will then bestow great wealth on you. And so it's part of the plot of Ben Jonson's play The Alchemist, but it also appears in a couple of really great stories. And my favourite one is this pamphlet about a lady called Judith Phillips who tricked a man into stripping down and putting a saddle on his back, and then she rode him on all fours around a tree several times as part of this ritual to summon the Fairy Queen. And then she said, give me some of your money and I'll go give it to the Fairy Queen, and then she will bestow great wealth and hidden treasure upon you. And obviously she didn't. She ran off with all the money, but was eventually kind of caught and brought to trial. There does seem to be, whether it's a kind of more openness to discuss it, or whether there's something about changes in literary attitudes in the early modern period that makes it more acceptable to talk about fairies in literature. There definitely seems to be more of this folkloric tradition appearing in these kind of accounts during the early modern period.
And you were, in your discussion of belief regarding fairies in this period, I think it's interesting because the last example that you just talked about, the woman may or may not have believed in fairies, but she was certainly using someone else's sincere belief in them to her own pragmatic ends. And I think that it's interesting, this idea, it may have been Yeats that first said this, but the idea that fairies are always going and never gone. My goodness, in the trial records of Joan of Arc, when talking about this fairy tree where people believe that these fairy women would gather at times, the people that were interviewed as part of her court case were saying, oh yes, in my grandparents' time this happened. And I mean, even in the 12th century account by Gerald of Wales, in his travels through Wales, he writes about a priest who ostensibly told Gerald about being taken away voluntarily to the strange land below the earth that was filled with gold and had no sky but was always basked in twilight. And after Gerald's recounting of this tale, which clearly has a lot of fairy tropes in it, he says with almost discomfort that while some may find this sort of outlandish and unlikely, that there are many wonders that God made in the world, and far be it from him to say what God can and cannot create. So the idea of belief, I think, is often talked about as a binary, an on-off switch, but I think in reality it's a really complex spectrum.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it definitely shows that there was at least some belief. And it's interesting, that idea that they are always these creatures that existed in previous generations. I mean, it comes up in Geoffrey Chaucer as well, in the Canterbury Tales.
Oh.
He at the start of The Wife of Bath's tale, he talks about fairies who once inhabited the land, but he's using it as a joke. He's saying that where once all these fairies walked, now there are only holy men going around begging for money and pestering people on the street, on the roads and things.
That's interesting, because what I think the rituals to summon fairies shows is, at the very least, there was some belief in them, even up into the 17th century and later. There are texts that are produced after that point, because you don't try to summon a spirit if you do not believe that the spirit is there to be summoned, or being, I guess, in this case, since it's unclear whether it's a spirit or what it is.
So yeah, this idea, I mean, I think the other interesting thing about always situating fairies in the past is also how time seems to distort in relation to fairy. There's several different accounts. For example, there's an old Irish tale, Imran Bran, where Bran goes on this voyage to the land of women and spends a couple of days there feasting and drinking. When he comes back, a huge amount of time has passed, way more than he spent on this fairy island. And none of the people on shore, they've heard of his voyage as something that happened like a long, long time ago, but none of them know him. And as soon as one of his crew tries to jump off and step on shore, he just disintegrates into ash. And there's a couple of different stories like this. So another one is in Walter Map, another 12th century writer, and he talks about the legend of King Hurla. And King Hurla goes to this, he meets with this race of fairies who take them to his realm, and they feast and drink there again, and then come back to their own realm, and 300 years have passed. And again, one of them tries to jump off their horse and just disintegrates. It just turns to ash. And so the story then becomes about them being these doomed riders that have to travel the land constantly on horseback. And they've been dehumanized by the process of going into fairyland, into the otherworld. And that then, for Map, that then becomes the origin of the Wild Hunt, this kind of mythic Germanic tradition of these hunters who kind of cross the land on this mythical hunt, which is sometimes, so this as well is kind of connecting it to a bunch of different mythologies, because sometimes the Wild Hunt is led by someone like King Hurla, or sometimes it's Odin, sometimes it's King Arthur is even sometimes attributed with it in a few accounts.
Fascinating. Part of the anxiety around the identity of what you're conjuring when you're conjuring a fairy is also that fuzzy line between both fairies and ghosts, but also fairies and humans that have been taken. There's often this idea that once you've been sort of stolen away by fairies, do you become a fairy yourself? It's often stricken me how sometimes there are fairy names that you summon that are just human names. And it's sort of a question of, is a fairy something that, does a fairy have to be born, or can it be made?
I really like the fairy Tobias. It's
Yes.
it's just not a name you expect attributed with a fairy.
Like when you think of spirit names like Azazel, even Oberon, and then Tobias, and another one, Margaret. It's just like, what?
Margaret. That's great. The fairy Margaret. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a sense that there's a possibility of the human entering fairy being irrevocably changed and dehumanized.
Mm-hmm.
You certainly see that in Lanval. When Lanval goes off to fairy at the end, he's kind of described as no one knows what became of him. He went off into fairyland and was never seen again. And just this sense of this fairyland as somewhere that might strip you of your humanity, as this kind of other place that you might go to.
When the poet William Butler Yeats was a great Irish nationalist and lover of sort of Celtic and fairy traditions, but what people tend not to know about him is that he also practiced magic. In fact, he wrote an account in which he used one of the very fairy summoning spells that I'm studying that was centuries older than him. It started by the words Veni, Veni, Regina Pygmaeorum, which means come, come, queen of the pygmies or fairies. And he talks about how with the help of a medium he used this spell to summon the fairy queen, and one of the questions that he asked her before she got angry with him for asking too many questions was whether it was true that fairies steal away Christian men and women to fairy. And the response that he ostensibly received I always found very haunting. It was, "We switch the body," which is the human and fairy spirit switched.
Very odd, yeah, very strange. That Yeats, the kind of the fear in there about where you place fairies in a Christian worldview is quite an interesting point as well, and that seems to come up quite a lot. We kind of mentioned previously about where do you classify them? Are they demons? Are they angels? Are they something other? And I think one of the best examples I've come across for that is the story of Thomas the Rhymer. And certainly, so the version I'm most familiar with is an older, it's 15th century, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 15th century Scottish romance called Thomas of Ercildoune, which is the same story essentially. And you get this account of Thomas who's resting by the banks of a river, and a fairy comes up to him and he convinces her to sleep with him, and they do. And then she's kind of horribly transfigured into this monstrous creature. Just like kind of really descriptive of just how ugly she becomes essentially, and Thomas even speaks this. He has this line where he's I think she might be a devil. I'm worried that I'm about to be taken away by a devil, and she kind of reassures him saying, "No, I'm not, but come with me to my fairy realm." And they travel. They again, similar to the William of Newburgh story, they go under a hill. They go into this hill and travel through this kind of pitch black realm until they come to a place where the road splits into multiple options basically, and then one road leads to heaven, one to paradise, one to hell, one to purgatory, and then the final road leads to fairies. So it is very clearly kind of marked out as this other realm distinct from the more heavenly realms.
Right. It's so fascinating how that ballad so perfectly captures how they just do not fit and yet are made to fit in this tradition into the Christian worldview. I'm familiar with a much later version where the 5 roads are reduced to 3, but the line has always stuck in my mind when in this version the fairy queen pauses when you see the different paths, and she says to him, "See not yon narrow road all thick beset with thorns and briars? That is the path of righteousness, though after it but few inquires. And see ye not yon broad, broad road that runs across the lily leven? That is the path of wickedness, though some call it the road to heaven. And see ye not yon bonny road that runs about the ferny brae? That is the path to fair Elfland, where you and I tonight may gay."
Nice. Yeah. Just this kind of complete otherness, essentially, but still a part of that Christian worldview to an extent.
Right.
Yeah.
They found a way to weave it in, even if it is made as the other path.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all we have time for, right? But
yes, I'm afraid so. But it was a pleasure to speak to you today.
It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you as well, and thank you.
Thank you.
The producers of History Chat were Henry Marsh and Tabitha Stanmore. It was brought to you with the kind support of the South West and Wales Doctoral Training Partnership and the Digital Humanities Lab at the University of Exeter.